You know, when you think about crime, where does your mind go? Probably straight to the criminal, right? Who did it? Why they do it? How do we punish them? But that's only ever half the story. So today, we're going to flip the script and look at the other half, the science of the victim, a really fascinating field called victimology.
And wow, this quote from President Gerald Ford back in '75, it just hits the nail on the head, doesn't it? For centuries, the person who actually suffered the crime was basically a footnote in their own story because the entire justice system was focused somewhere else completely.
So this slide kind of lays it all out nice and simple. On one side, you've got criminology, which is all about the criminal. Then you've got victimology, which is all about the victim. And what we're talking about today is this huge historic shift in focus from one to the other.
Okay, so to really get this, we got to start with the old way of thinking. So, Section 1, Criminology's Forgotten Man. We're going to see how the victim was pretty much left out of the picture entirely. For the longest time, the system really only had one thing on its mind: the offender. Everything, and I mean everything, was about punishing or reforming or rehabilitating the person who broke the law. And the victim? Well, they were often just treated like another piece of evidence. Their personal suffering, their needs, almost totally ignored.
And this is where that powerful label comes from, the forgotten man. It's such a perfect phrase, right? It describes someone who absolutely should have been at the center of the story, but instead they got pushed to the sidelines. Their trauma, their loss, just unaddressed by the very system that was supposed to deliver justice.
But of course, that was all about to change. Which brings us to Section 2, the science of the victim. And we're going to dive into the birth of this new and, yeah, kind of controversial field.
So the actual scientific study of victims, that really gets going in the 1940s and 50s. You have these guys Mendelssohn and von Hentig. They're now called the fathers of victimology. And they started creating the first ever classifications of victims. They were looking for patterns. Von Hentig, for example, he studied homicide victims and came up with this theory that certain personalities, like what he called the depressive type, might be easier targets. Then about a decade later, a researcher named Marvin Wolfgang drops this really controversial idea on the world.
And that idea was called victim precipitation. Now, this was a huge deal and super controversial. Basically, it suggested that in some cases, a victim's own actions might have accidentally played a part in the crime. And you can totally see why this was so debated, right? It walks a really fine line and could easily slip into victim blaming. But it was a radical new way of thinking, seeing the victim as something other than a completely passive bystander.
This whole line of thinking led to another key idea: the penal couple. Mendelssohn came up with this term, and it's all about the deep connection between the offender and the victim. Instead of seeing them as two totally separate people, he saw them as two sides of the same coin, two parts of a single event. And here's why that's so important. It completely reframed the crime itself. It forced the justice system to actually look at the victim's role in their relationship to the person who committed the crime.
Okay, so with these new ideas starting to catch on, the next big question was, well, who even is a victim? That brings us to Section 3, defining the victim. We'll see how the focus grew to protect the most vulnerable among us.
You see, early on, the idea of a victim was super narrow. People thought of them as just, well, naive or unsuspecting folks. But as victimology grew up, so did the definition. Today, a victim is understood to be anyone, a person, a group, even a company, who suffers injury, loss, or hardship because of a crime. It's just a much broader, more inclusive way of looking at it.
And what this new, broader definition did was let experts really shine a light on specific groups that were particularly vulnerable. I'm talking about the elderly, kids, victims of sex offenses, women facing certain kinds of harm, and also minority groups who might be targeted during things like riots or social conflicts.
And this wasn't just talk, it led to actual, real-world changes. Take Israel, for instance. A new law there created the role of a young interrogator just for child victims. Their whole job is to talk with the child in a safe space, shielding them from the trauma of a police station or, a scary courtroom cross-examination.
And in a similar vein, over in the U.S., a huge step forward was the creation of rape crisis centers. These centers were staffed by women, including survivors themselves, and they provided absolutely crucial counseling and therapy. It was a recognition that the emotional and psychological wounds needed just as much care as the legal case.
So this new focus on the victim's well-being, it naturally led to the next big question: what about what they lost? And that brings us right to Section 4. The right to compensation. This is where we see theory turn into real,
tangible justice. Okay, this slide right here shows a massive shift in how the law thinks. The old way was this Latin phrase ubi remedium, ibi jus. Basically, it meant you only had a right if there was already a legal remedy written down for it. But the modern idea completely flips that on its head. Ubi jus, ibi remedium. Where there is a right, there has to be a remedy. And the key takeaway here is huge. If your right is violated, the law is now obligated to find a solution for you. And we can see this exact principle at work right here. Just look at these two cases from India. In the older case, the offender pays a 500 rupee fine, and 400 of that goes to the victim's family. Okay, but now look at the more recent case. The fine is way smaller compared to the compensation. The court ordered a 1 lakh rupee payment to go directly to taking care of the deceased victim's child. It's a crystal clear shift away from just punishing the bad guy and toward actually meaningfully helping the victim.
So where has this whole journey brought us? Let's wrap things up in our final section, a new place in justice. We're going to chart the victim's path from the sidelines right to center stage.
Look, the rise of victimology has completely changed the game for criminal justice. The focus isn't just on the offender anymore, not by a long shot. Thanks to new laws, new support systems, and that whole new way of seeing the penal couple, the victim has been pulled out of the shadows and put right in the spotlight. That forgotten man is, finally, forgotten no more.
And that leaves us with just one last, really interesting question to chew on, which comes straight from the source material. When you think about its unique focus and how important it's become, has the time finally come for victimology to be its own thing? Not just a little part of criminology, but its own separate field of study. What do you think?